Welcome to Sumbits, where we decode the PowerSchool development experience. Sumbits is brought to you by MBA. Let's start the show.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Sumbits. Sorry about this. We're a week late, but that'll be okay. It's for good reason. We had to wait and get a kind of an all-star hitter as a guest today. We have Jim Parsons joining us today. Welcome, Jim. Today's topic is going to be the PowerSchool API, and I'm going to be honest, not something that I know a whole lot of, so I'm going to be listening and hopefully learning along with you listeners today. But before we get too far, got to let you know what we're drinking today. I'm having a little Elijah Craig small batch, pretty basic bourbon, but it is delicious. What are you guys sipping on today?
Was I drinking that one last time?
I think you were.
I recently have been Legend. That's
we'll
a nice
go with
one.
that.
Yep.
I have actually not had that.
Well, it's a Kentucky straight bourbon. Two legendary creators. So it's like it's a Japanese and Kentucky two blenders that got together and made something fancy schmancy. It's good though. I like it.
They let the magic happen.
Fancy like you, my friend. I am back to my signature brewery again today, but a different brew. I don't think I've had this one before. This is the New Glarus Brewery once again. The Kid Kolsch. If nothing else, it's got a pretty label. It's got a goat on it. So, what more could a guy ask for?
A label.
That's like I could go down that road, but I won't.
If anyone knows me, you probably know that my drink of choice is the Diet Coke. Yep.
I did know that.
You know, two fingers of red eye, and there we go, right?
I gotta say, Jim, no offense, buddy, right off the bat, I don't want to be bashing our guests, but you did not sell that as well as Vance Allen sold his Pepsi. Just saying.
Yeah.
He's a Pepsi guy.
I can upsell the Diet Coke because I've habitually been a Diet Coke too. Until recently, I tried the Coke Zero.
Oh,
and it tastes like Coke.
So I'm not gonna lie, this is a bit of a
you know what their
tangent.
slogan was? It said, "It tastes so much like Coke, we should sue ourselves."
Well, there you go. Because and my wife was trying to convince me all this time to stop drinking Diet because it does have a different taste. I like it.
But I'm so used to it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, you get used to something. That's what you drink. So.
Occasionally, you'd go to a restaurant and they wouldn't serve you the Diet Coke. They'd give you the Coke and you take a sip and you're like, oh, it's so good. But you're also like, so much sugar. No. So this one, now it's a nice, hey, so good. But the only problem is now when you order it and they give you the wrong one, you'll have no clue.
Yeah.
I actually, a long time ago, my wife got me to switch over to Diet Coke because at the time that's what she drank. And it was disgusting to me at first, but I eventually got used to it. And now I prefer Diet Coke flavor-wise. It doesn't even matter about the sugar. However, I will say a Coca-Cola from a McDonald's fountain machine is magical. It's something different.
I cannot remember.
I used to work at McDonald's, so G is every day or whatever they calibrate these things. Make sure they have the amount of syrup and carbonation and temperature. Everything had to be perfect, and those machines will get off if you just leave them alone, and then they'll start to taste terrible.
And I cannot remember. I heard once though. There is an astronomical amount of money that was spent on figuring out those fountains and the best way to inject the CO2 with the water and the syrup at the perfect moments. So when you watch it, you always see it goes it's almost like a zebra stripe. They spent billions figuring out that technique.
And that's what you can do with McDonald's money, right?
And they sell it for $1 now. It's like $1.
All right, let's bring it back on track here. For our guests that don't know Jim, I'm going to let you kind of introduce yourself and let us know where you're at and how long you've been in PowerSchool and how did you end up in this PowerSchool world? Ready to go.
Okay, well, going back a little bit. First of all, my name is Jim Parsons, and I'm in California at a private school, Valley Christian. And if you recognize that name, probably because Roger Sprick started here years ago.
Roger.
And he was the one who hired me. So I came on board. One of his questions was, do you know anything about PowerSchool? And I said, no. I have a lot of programming experience and computer networking experience, and that was primarily my job. But I got right into PowerSchool rather quickly, mainly from the server end in, not from the operational part. So I kind of started with customizations and making things work on that end, and knowing nothing about things like scheduling or even how to change someone's demographic data. It's like, where do I click on? And so, yeah, so it's been about 10 years now since I started in that. And then going to the PSUGs, I volunteered to be one of the conferences there. And ever since, they've kind of roped me in to do things like customizations and the API. One of the reasons why I did the API, I'm not really an API expert by any means, was I do a lot of programming on the outside, like PHP and other things. And knowing that the API is able to get data in and out, I learned how to do that and use it on some of the other applications that I built for our school here.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna let Eric chime in on this. For our viewers that have no idea what we're talking about when we say API, give us a quick rundown on what the PowerSchool API is and what it's actually used for. And if you want to start getting into why you would use the API, feel free to do that as well.
I'm sorry. So you assumed when we recorded this episode that I knew what the API was.
I think you're familiar.
Well, what is
the
API in general?
What is the API?
So yeah, that's a great question, because is the API a PowerSchool thing? And the answer is no. An API and an application program interface is
programming.
Oh, forgive me. Thank you, Master. It's just really a way to communicate.
I don't have it put on the screen next to me at all.
Peter.
It's a common concept that's used in many systems to allow third-party systems to interact with their data. Right. And I think, not speaking as someone who's got an intimate knowledge of the inner workings of PowerSchool, my guess is that PowerSchool realized several years ago that we really need to facilitate this third-party interaction with our system, because a big part of the PowerSchool community is these third-party, these ISV partners. And they were coming up with creative ways in the past, an interesting way. And I got to admit, I've done this before in the dark ages. It's not the best approach. Something called screen scraping. And some partners would actually create software, and this software would mimic a user logging into the PowerSchool system and navigating through the PowerSchool system and interacting with the pages in order to retrieve and manipulate the data that it needed to manipulate. And it functions. That's one way to do things.
Clever does that.
Yeah.
That's what.
But it is a little archaic and it's prone to error. I mean, perfect example. You think about when was this, guys? Jim, you've been around long enough for sure, and I think maybe Ryan and Sean too. Do you remember the username ;password days?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well,
yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah, so back in the day when you logged into PowerSchool, it was a username followed by a semicolon followed by your password. There was only one input box to log in. And back in the day when I had to write screen scraping software, that's how you log in. And this is the perfect example. As soon as PowerSchool updates to a different model, your screen scraping software breaks.
All breaks.
All breaks.
And they're not going to worry as they're updating the PowerSchool interface whether it's going to break screen scraping. But I would imagine that as the API evolves, there will be backwards compatibility concerns there. So it's really a huge step forward into modernizing PowerSchool and allowing it to integrate with other systems. And one last thing, I don't want to drone on for too long, but in addition to the API allowing PowerSchool to interact with other third-party vendors, it's also used internally in PowerSchool as a more efficient way to read, write, update data from within the PowerSchool student information system.
Not just more efficient, more secure, and more stable.
I could go on for hours about the security. I'm sure we'll get there. I have strong opinions about the security.
Well, yeah.
So the API, I sometimes liken it unto the GUI. You have a GUI, which is the graphical user interface, allows a human to talk to the computer. An API allows another computer to talk to your computer. One computer to another. And so it doesn't have to be pretty and fancy with, colorful buttons. It just has to be data, raw, back and forth.
Absolutely.
Which nerds like that prefer. Some days.
Yeah. So, and I've used the API for a number of different things, internally and externally. And it's a good way to get data back and forth. And I do remember the screen scraping days. In fact, we had one application where we had to get data for our iPads, namely things like the Apple Care expiration date, things like that. Well, Apple has this website you can go to and enter in the serial number, and you could get that data. But they then quickly changed it, and my screen scraping thing broke, and they added this CAPTCHA, this human, prove you're a human, which a computer can't get by those things.
And just so everyone knows, anyone who gets frustrated on any website and has to deal with CAPTCHA, that's exactly why CAPTCHAs exists.
Right.
Yeah. And the CAPTCHA, in case anyone doesn't know, is like those kind of weird misshapen letters that you can maybe 80% of the time make out what they're supposed to be, and you're supposed to type it in. That's trying to block hackers with screen scraping, just trying to bash in a whole bunch of attempts. Sorry, Jim, please go on.
It still takes 4 or 5 attempts to figure it out.
Right. Yeah, figure that out, right?
There's your CAPTCHA right there.
Yeah, I don't remember what it actually stands for, but CAPTCHA. It's to prove you're a human, right?
Yeah.
Are you real?
No bots.
So APIs don't deal with CAPTCHA. They have things like OAuth and other handshaking password.
Yeah, they expect the security and the authorization and the access to be granted and managed well beforehand.
Right.
It's you're talking about analogies here. You got your hose and you got your outlet to the street and you're plugging it in, and that's what's bringing the water into your home now, or vice versa, and you tighten it on good, and there you go.
Yeah, I think for our viewers and listeners, if you're sitting here watching and you're going, this is above me. I'm definitely not using anything like this in my PowerSchool. If you go into your plugin management console and you start clicking through some of the things that you may have installed via plugin, there's definitely a good chance that at least 1 or 2 of those. Jim, you mentioned Apple. They now use Apple School Manager,
right,
which uses API now. So if you ever go in there and you start seeing things like OAuth tokens and, what the secret and the key and all that fun stuff, that's using the API.
Yep. And anytime you write a Power Query, you're basically writing an API endpoint to get data out of the server. A Power Query is the API. In fact, that's 90% of what I do.
And here's one of the greatest things. I have my complaints about the API, and I hope we get to those. But it's when you step back and look at the big picture, I think it's a wonderful thing. And the Power Queries are one of the main reasons. Let's talk about the dark ages of AutoCom and AutoSend, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we had to do back in the day. And for anybody that's not familiar with Power Queries, even if development and implementation of Power Queries is beyond your capability, knowing that it's an option and that you can reach out to somebody to help you to implement something like this. Power queries are so powerful when you need to push information. I think this has come up for me multiple times in my career.
Oh, yeah.
I really need to get this information out of PowerSchool to this third party. And with AutoSend, somebody correct me if I'm wrong because I've never done an AutoSend, but I believe it's just basic student information and you can't filter it down into your whole student table in your database or maybe just currently enrolled. Ryan, you're looking like you're contemplating.
You can send some attendance data.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so like you can get basically certain tables that are one-to-manys off the student's table, or at least have relationships with the student's table. So like Sean said, attendance, I think you could get even course data, like scheduling and stuff, but it's still pretty minimal in what you can actually get.
Right.
So compared to what you can write into a query, basically you can write a query to get basically anything you want out of that database. Once you have implemented that as a Power Query in Data Export Manager, you have the ability to schedule that Power Query to run on a scheduled basis and export those results either to a drive on your local server if you're self-hosted or via an SFTP connection that you've set up. I'll leave it at that without going into too many gory details. I just think that's a really important thing for folks to know because I've seen posts just this morning. I saw a post on the PowerSchool forum, the psug.io. You know, how can I get this information to my third party? And first thing that came to my mind is you need a Power Query.
Yep.
Unfortunately, you know, not everybody has the skill set to make those Power Queries, but knowing that that's an option and you can reach out to somebody to help make that happen, it's a huge step in the right direction.
And the thing about Power Queries is once you, like, if you already have a handle on SQL, you've got a good foot forward already. And then your hardest Power Query is probably your first Power Query because it's all the formatting that goes along with it and all the file structure in that plugin. That's really the biggest, I think, challenge. And then of course, there's more nuance to the SQL in that Power Query because of what's allowed in a Power Query versus what's allowed or what you can do with SQL or in a T-list. But I don't want to scare people off, so I still stand by knowing SQL is a great foot forward. And then once you write your first Power Query, you're going to have that as a template going forward too.
Yeah. So internally, let's see, some of the projects that I've done internally mainly are either custom pages. So going through and maybe, you know, we're so used to using the T-list SQL. Of course, we know that's strongly deprecated. And so that kind of pushed me to use the API more and writing all the Angular tools to get the data from the database into my tables. Rather than using T-list, I would use a Power Query. And it worked. So it's like, nice. So then I started using it for other things, pushing data back and forth. So just as an example, one project that we're working on now is a visitor check-in. So someone walks up and there'll be a computer there that's pretty much locked down to just one page. And it'll have a completely single page app, all Angular driven. And it'll take a picture of them, print them out a label, does the whole works, and
cool.
It pushes their data right into the contacts table.
Wow.
I feel like that once. Not that I ever even got my foot off the ground about it, but awesome.
Using API. So that's just one example. Another thing really cool that we use, and I have to say that I'm going to point out a problem that I encountered was I wrote this Power Query to pull schedule data for our bookstore program. The bookstore program that we have I wrote it years ago to basically, it's a point of sale system for our books. We're a private school, high school. And so all the students, kind of like a college, you get to buy your books, right? Some of them spend well over $1,000 if they're in AP courses. It's a lot of money, right? Most of them
prepared for university, I guess.
Yeah, it's crazy. But they log in, their parents do, and they can see their student's schedule. The schedule is pulled in from PowerSchool via the API, right? And the bookstore matches up the resources that they need for each classes, populates the part, and they can then check out and pay their bill, and then the invoice gets printed out. The bookstore people fill it up in a bag, and when they come to school, here it is. So it's kind of neat. But this year,
you got your own very own Amazon warehouse.
So one of the problems with the scheduling side, which I'm not really into the scheduling side, and this is like one of the first year Roger's not here, right? So it's like, okay. So all of a sudden, school started. People are going on to the bookstore program, and their schedule is flip flop. First semester is second, and second semester is first. I'm scratching my head, and I'm thinking, what in the world happened? Well, you have to roll back, right? When they created years and terms, they created second semester first.
Their term IDs were back.
Oh, no.
Right? So my Power Query probably should have been written differently, but I kind of cued in on the term ID as the semester number, right? So it was an easy fix on the bookstore side, but we left it in PowerSchool. I wasn't about to go back and change all those, even though everyone was saying, yeah, it's possible. You could go in there and, change the term IDs and all the particular tables you need. But we have a lot of external things that are already pushed out. All of our, Apple School Manager classes are all session ID. That would totally blow out all our session IDs, right? If we imported them all over again. So I'm like, I don't know if I want to do that, but I'm going to attempt at some point. I'm going to go to my test server and attempt. Vance said you can just use if you're self-hosted, you could just use go right in there and just do it in developer and just change them, right, without going into PowerSchool, because the PowerSchool has a lot of things, but I don't know. I don't know if I want to, because when I was talking to support, they're like, we're not going to support that. So it probably won't happen.
I've got a query that you can run that will actually look for any, like say you want to find all columns or all tables with a column that have an ID in the name, and it'll search for the value too. Okay. So it'll tell you how many tables have a column with the word ID in it, so term ID, and with a value of 3201, I'll assume.
3201 or 3202, something like that.
And then I never knew this. So you're telling me if I create my year-long term and then I create quarter one, that quarter one is going to be 3101. Mm-hmm. And then 2, 3, 4 are going to be 2, 3, and 4. But then I decide I want semesters too.
Yeah, 5 and
my semesters. I mean, I guess, I guess I'd never run into that scenario before. I just always assumed that semester one was an 01.
Well, it is if you create them in that order, but there's nothing in PowerSchool that depends upon that, other than some sorting. So on the term drop down, the little drop down in the corner, they're out of order. Semester two's first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It doesn't really affect anything other than what we've done externally. So,
another thing, this is slightly off topic, but somewhat on topic, that I found really interesting. And maybe we've talked about this on a podcast before, but the ID columns in PowerSchool are not guaranteed to be unique.
That's why they have DC ID.
Right. And I actually ran into a scenario one time in a support case where there were 2 schools with the same ID. Strangely enough.
Wow.
There was a program that was failing, and it's like, well, you just got to join based on the school's DC ID because that's guaranteed to be unique.
It could have had 2 instances of PowerSchool and then merged them somehow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a good point.
I don't know how
now that I bring that up, I mean, even the term ID is the perfect example of the ID is not guaranteed to be unique because
that's like the loosest example of what ID means in all databases as far as that. It's like
Right.
It's not an ID by the actual definitions of databases.
So back to the subject at hand. I want to answer the question why. Why would somebody want to use the API over something else that they already know?
Well, I mean, I'll talk about things that I've done with it in PowerTeacher Pro. Not specific examples because I can't, but manipulating and calling grade data and students' assignment data and the standards and things like that. You don't have to write. Number one, you don't have to go and reinvent the wheel to write a query to get that data. You have these nice API calls that already come in that the gradebook already uses that you can use too. And it has all the data organized in JSON format by class, by student, by term, by assignment. And you got to spend a little time to get familiar with it. But once you do, you realize that the actual parameters that you pass in and the little bit of code you have to write to get that is so much easier and more manageable than having to write all these other queries and then write all these other forms and do all the other stuff on the flip side to update it when you can just, send in another payload with those changes. You deal with a few errors, a few, 500s and two, all whatever, but overall, so much more efficient, helpful.
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of documentation, so you're kind of like opening up the inspector and you're looking at the network payloads and the network traffic to see exactly what it looks like, and then you're mimicking that. That's one of the things that I did when I wrote the. I don't know if you guys know about the. I call it steel alloy. Heard of it?
No.
Can't say that I have.
Kind of a take on blue steel.
I was thinking that, okay, but
so let's say you have a an editor, like I use Visual Studio, and you do all your coding in that. How do you get that into CPM?
Copy and paste.
Copy paste. Well, steel alloy, any changes you make go right into CPM.
Wait, you wrote this in what language?
It's a two-part. The one part is a page that basically looks at the other part. The other part is a Node.js app that's running on the box that has your editor on it.
okay.
What it does, it looks at the folder that you pointed it to, and any changes you make in that folder are dumped to a configuration file. The page in PowerSchool constantly looks at that configuration file. It sees, hey, this file was deleted. Let me delete it out of CPM. Hey, this file was changed. Let me update it in CPM. So it constantly does that.
People are going to ask, including people in this meeting, what are your thoughts on sharing that and making that available? Because I mean,
it's so totally in beta right now, and it's very shareable. So if you wanted to take a spin on it, it works fine.
Just
so,
let you know, because
I can even demonstrate it, but not now, of course, but afterwards.
That's awesome.
That's just.
And I totally use the API, internal API for that. And if you think about it, it's an external API on the Node.js side, which is basically an API that allows this custom page to talk to your local box. So,
That's awesome.
You guys remember that time that Jim said that he wasn't like an API expert?
I don't just use the PowerSchool API. I use my own APIs. Okay, so one of the things the access page, where the student access page, where you can put the passwords. Yeah. So I have a customization on that, which basically talks to another API that I wrote. So you can click, you can create their Active Directory account and their Google account right from the access page.
That's awesome.
Boom, done. Things like that. But it's not just an API on the PowerSchool side. It's an API on the other server side. Enables those two pages to talk and do other functions that kind of extend your page a little bit.
And we know forget that there's a big part of that.
You have to write both halves. And it's secure because the API actually calls PowerSchool back and it gets the login ID of the currently logged in admin to make sure that that person is the one making the request to create the Google account.
Jim, you may want to wipe out the internet from your email address, because you may get bombarded after this episode.
Yeah.
You guys have a large viewership?
Millions, Jim. Millions.
You have enough that you probably get contacted.
But the API, think of you have one computer that wants to talk to another computer so that you can accomplish a task which you can't normally accomplish on your own without doing some work. And you talked about, well, why use the API? Well, for example, let's say you wanted to do this. One of the things that I had to do really in a pinch just recently was to provision.
Wait. But before you go on and tell us how you did this in a pinch, I'm just going to call it now that it was also something amazing and really cool. And a pinch barely describes it.
It's totally old school, right? I basically exported the students that needed to be provisioned in this one it was one class that had this one book, right? And most of our other classes use different booksellers and stuff, but we had to provision this one course. And they said, well, can we set it up, through the API? I go, it's just one course. I don't want to roster the entire school just for one class, right? I wanted to make just they showed me, okay, you can go to the legacy, create a zip file with these 4 CSV files. And so I manually created them, right? Not hard to do, but every time there's a roster change, I've got to go in there, make the change, type it in, cut and paste from PowerSchool, fix my CSV files, re-zip them up, and then upload it to the book login. So it's well, it's a perfect job for the API. I could write a Power Query that pushes those 2 CSV files, and then on the other end, zip them up and send them via SFTP to the thing, and do it every day. Just re-roster the course. And so why use the API? Well, if you want to do things manually, don't use the API. Create your myriad of Excel files, export them all in CSVs, get them all lined up, spend hours doing it, right?
And then upload every
day.
day.
Send them off, right? We've all done that. Or create a Power Query, or use the API to automatically get that data and schedule it in a script. And then once it's done, it's
no, you don't.
Sit back and drink Diet Coke.
You said there isn't much documentation for it. Now, I both agree and disagree. I disagree because I think there is a lot of documentation for it. However, I disagree in that it is
available.
Clear. I find there to be just things missing. I feel like there's always just big chunks and steps on what you're missing when you're looking at it. And it's so, just like you're saying, it is exactly what I've done, where you sit there and you watch the network traffic and you watch the console and you look at the payloads and the responses and everything. That's where I've done my best learning and interpretation. And frankly, I've been able to apply what I learned from the network traffic to the documentation that I found. Because
I don't know where the documentation is. I know there's documentation for the API, but a lot of that internal API, like from PowerTeacher and from the new contacts.
True. Yes.
That's not documented that where I can find it. There's no Swagger IO page anywhere that lists it all out and lets you experiment. It'd be nice, but there isn't. A lot of the APIs that I see out there, because APIs they've been around a long time. And when they first came out, they did this thing called versioning, right? Where they, /V1 and then /V2 and so forth and so on. Well, that got old quick, because the reason they did the versioning is for the exact reason that Eric alluded to, is that when you change something, it breaks something, right? So if they version something, you don't change it. When you change it, you just make a new version so that the next person coming can use version 2. Well, version 1 could have a lot of holes in it. Well, what do? Patch them up and then break them?
And it does.
And it kind of does. I mean, there are holes in the version 1 endpoint that they should patch up. But I mean, if they did, think about all the things that would break that use that. So, I mean, I can see.
That's why things get strongly deprecated.
Of keeping that. But then they went to this unversioned API, which constantly kind of evolves. And so they work with their partners and they make sure any changes that are made are quickly fixed, within their circle. If you're outside the circle using the API and something changes, you got to figure it out, right? You got to figure it out and fix it.
Yeah.
But
So on the topic of documentation, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I wasn't saying anything.
Oh, okay.
No,
Sorry,
it sounded like the microphones did a thing.
Oh, okay. On the topic of documentation, obviously API is a bit more of an advanced topic compared to what we've covered previously on this podcast. But, I always want to have, I would like to at least point our viewers and listeners to somewhere if they want to get started. Is there anywhere that they can look at or go to get started? Just, try to do something basic using the PowerSchool API.
Well, we started talking about Power Queries. That's probably the basics of the API that most people will use. The other part would be if you're creating a custom page and you want to just get data from a certain endpoint. You can find a lot of that documentation on the developer site. PowerSchool has the developer site. You have to have access to it. And if you're, if you're a school, you can request access from the developer site, or if you're a partner.
I think you have to be a technical contact with your school.
Yeah, you have to be a technical contact or a developer with the technical contact on your developers.
And I would encourage when you get to that site, by all means, explore it and look through it, because you'll find a lot of stuff that you probably didn't realize you were looking for. But when you're trying to find something specific, I would almost say go straight to like the PSI community or something and ask people, if I'm on the developer site and I want to find out about this, where do I go? Because there is some cryptic navigation almost. That's like
the developer site has a page under their API for resources, and that explains all the different endpoints and how to, formulate your payload to either push data in PowerSchool or to pull data out of PowerSchool. This is apart from Power Queries, just regular raw API use. Push data in, push data out, and it's not that hard once you get it working. One of the hard things to do, because the API is computer to computer, it's not like you're going to do anything with it unless you have some other software. I'm speaking more externally, some other piece of software, or internally if you're using
Node.js being a perfect example, which the developer site will walk you through setting up.
Yep, exactly. Node.js is a perfect server-side environment. If you're familiar with JavaScript already, I would say get into Node.js. You want to go into other languages, Python, PHP. A lot of these scripting languages that are server-side are pretty robust. They have all the tools you need. And there are some libraries, we call them libraries out there. They're basically little code snippets and functions that allow you to streamline a lot of that. But that's only if you're a coder. The typical end user probably won't be doing a lot of the API stuff, right?
Right.
So let me throw this out there. One of our primary rules on this podcast is we don't sell anything. But I want to promote an MBA product right now because it's free.
Okay. That's fair.
And if you head to the MBA website, mba-link.com, there's a free plugin out there called customization.
No promoting the guy who wrote it, though.
No, that guy is.
No credit to that guy.
We can't say much about that guy. But I want to say that in that plugin, there is a Power Queries, plugins and Power Queries tab, and there's reference in there. And even if you're not a crazy developer, if you know some SQL, Power Queries are going to frustrate you. They, like Ryan, you said earlier, you said your most frustrating Power Query is going to be your first one. I've written more than I remember, and they're still frustrating.
Well, because like I said, the nuance of writing SQL in a Power Query versus just writing SQL.
You go to you click that enable button, and you get those red errors. It's like
yeah.
Well, at At least you got to the point where you click the enable button.
Like, where is it?
But there are examples in the customization reference of just taking the simplest query and making it into a Power Query. And you can extrapolate from there. So I think that's a good place to start. Now that reference isn't obviously nearly as detailed as the documentation that we were talking about on the PowerSchool developer site. But I think it's more approachable as a starting point. So for what that's worth.
Perfect.
It's a very good customization. I highly recommend it.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself going to there a lot. We have it installed.
I go there.
Yeah.
I go there all the time to remind myself how that thing was done that I haven't done in 6 months. You know,
like completely switching topic, but harkening back to something you said over and over again. Laziness is a good part of coding, and now that you don't have to go to 10 or 20 or 30 different websites to find out the little gotchas and tidbits you're trying to remember is a great thing.
Or when you're looking at something you did a long time ago and you go, "Who wrote this?"
Oh wait,
right.
Where was my head at then?
So if you don't comment your code, you're in a world of hurt.
Oh, is that why I struggle so much?
Probably.
I think that's been mentioned a few
I
times
like
on
to
the
say
podcast.
I try to comment my code more, but I don't.
Well, some people think commenting slows things down, because the processor look at all that comments and stuff. I don't think it slows it down enough to worry about that. So
You're right. It doesn't slow it down for me. It's just the other side of lazy for me. The actual true lazy. That's what.
I wonder if I might, for a moment, Jim, kind of bring it back around, because we've talked a lot about the power of the API in being facilitating
The power.
inter-system communication, right? We've talked about using it. Sometimes we refer to the external API, and I'm using air quotes for anybody that's not watching, and the internal API.
3 fingers per hand.
triple quote.
But there's really only one API in PowerSchool, and it is valuable for things other than just third-party systems communicating with the PowerSchool database. And you've used the API, I'm going to air quote, the internal API. Again, they're both the same API. There are just different ways of authenticating that I have the right to access this information.
Right.
When you're using the API externally, that's done via the OAuth, which is a term that came up earlier, which is, we need not get into the gory details of that. But when you're using the API internally, it's really based upon the fact that I'm logged into PowerSchool, and it uses basically your security groups, your roles, your access as a user logged into PowerSchool to determine what API resources you can access. What information can I read? What information can I write, update, etc. So there are, I think, many scenarios when you want to use the API, or it's desirable, maybe not 100% necessary, to use the API when you're creating a custom page or things like that. I'm curious, Jim, when you do your development, obviously you said you've written some scripts, you've written your Node.js applications, you've written things that work external from PowerSchool to work with your PowerSchool data. When you're writing customizations, though, you're using the API in those customizations as well? And if so, are you using that exclusively or here and there? And can you tell us about that?
Not exclusively. The API isn't always available like on the parent portal as it would be on the admin portal, for example. So there's some things that you can't necessarily do with the API within PowerSchool. That's why I wrote PS Query. I don't know if you guys know, that's actually available for free on the Exchange. But PS Query, PS Query is basically being able to write to the database using jQuery or using JavaScript. Quite simple. It's kind of like submitting a form. So if you have like a table and it lists, all the students that don't have passwords, you could find, that's easy to find in a search, right? But then if you want to now assign them random passwords, you got to go to every one of those students' pages and create the password. Well, if you had that in a table and you had a button that said create random passwords for everybody in the table, and then you had another button that said push these to the database, you could do that. Just loop through the table elements, push those to the database using the API, or in this case, PS query, and it's all done on one page rather than going to each page. So there's so many examples that you could use the API or use some form of the API, or this little ad hoc API, if you want to call it that, to get data into PowerSchool and to get data out. And I'm always using T-List because it's easier to use. It works. You just have to realize that there are some security gotchas if you're not careful with the T-List, especially if there's sensitive data in there and you want to protect that. So whereas the API has it's wrapped into the data security framework, which allows that to be filtered through, like you said, roles, security groups, and things like that, whereas T-List is not. So I'm bouncing around here, but just to answer your question, yeah, I do use a lot of customizations that you write to the API and pull from the API, but that's not the only thing I do. In all my customizations, I use a number of different things.
So I really, this is a topic I'm really interested in personally. I feel like, and there's a term for what you're describing with the API and security, the data restriction framework, or DRF. And it's a wonderful thing, and it is a bane, in my personal opinion, at the same time.
Well, that's why my eyebrow went up when you said it's a wonderful thing.
Is this that part you were wanting to get to eventually?
I really wanted to get to this part because I've had some really frustrating experiences with the data restriction framework. And let me preface my tirade that I'm about to go on with, I don't want to be the poor SOB at PowerSchool that has to worry about having a hole in security and having student information released where it shouldn't go. And I would err on the side of caution. So let me just say that before I go on my tirade.
So you understand.
I don't want to be the one who's 100% responsible for it. I want to be behind the person who's responsible for the security, and they can catch all my screw ups.
So yeah. So basically, what's happening with this data restriction framework? Let's take it in the context of Power Queries. When you write and install a Power Query, it's not that query that's getting run and executed every time that it gets executed, especially when you're talking about PowerSchool internally. It depends on whether it's being run on the admin portal from the district office, or on the admin portal from a school, or on the teacher portal, or on the student portal. And here's the example that really ruffled my feathers. I was writing a customization that had to do.
You were really upset then if it ruffled your
my feathers were ruffled.
Of course, Eric doesn't say that unless he's serious. You don't want to see his feathers ruffled.
I was trying to retrieve
feathers now.
I know, you liking that? It's one of these days.
Growing on you.
Sorry for ruffling your feathers, man.
Back to my point. So I was writing an application that was attempting to retrieve scheduling information. So it's all about information, especially from the Power Scheduler tables. Okay. And I wanted to present that information to all three portals, admin, teacher, and public. And that information includes, what sections and what courses and what are the details for next year's schedule. And I developed everything on the admin side and tested it all out. And I'm like, all right, now I need to integrate this into the public portal. And this was developed using Power Queries because T-List SQL is strongly deprecated, and Power Queries are the way to go, and they're more secure. They're protected by the data restriction framework. Mm-hmm. Well, once I implemented my code on the public portal, things started breaking, and I, after a lot of messing around, figured out that it was because the data restriction framework in all of its wisdom decided that I was on the public portal, and this query, this Power Query I was accessing, it joined the teachers or school staff table. And in order to secure the data appropriately, it decided that I can't access a record in that table if I've never been, as a student, enrolled in a section that teacher taught. So I could only see the courses that were available next year on the schedule if they were taught by a teacher that's already taught me. So there's my tirade. It's a wonderful thing.
So what's the workaround for that?
T-list SQL.
It's like T-list.
And here's the one other thing.
You create a fake school, and you create one course for each teacher, and you put all the students in that course.
Okay, but when we're marketing a plugin to the masses and we're asking them to pay for it,
like, there's just a little setup to do before
it's
you.
just a sledgehammer to make it work.
A little bit of setup.
well,
It's a little bit of setup.
Bam.
Here's the other thing with the data restriction framework. And again, I'm not trying to say it shouldn't be there. It was a mistake. It was a huge undertaking, and it's necessary. The security needs to be there. But because those queries are getting rewritten and nested within other queries to ensure this data security integrity, the performance takes a ginormous hit.
Boom.
And in some of the work that I've done that's doing some really heavy lifting in data retrieval, that even with a basic query is going to require the user to stare at a loading prompt on their screen for a while.
Wow. Yeah.
They're going to get kind of upset.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just saying.
And then I'll tell you one of the nuances that I didn't, like I said, there's nuances, asterisks. No, of course, we all know the asterisks in the most a typical way when you're just writing or checking a table, select all, right? But let's say you want to count. That one caught me off guard, and I couldn't quite figure it out for some time because if you use count and then asterisk in a subquery, for instance, or any query, the error that you get when you're trying to start your query, when you're trying to install it, doesn't help you at all. It tells you something's invalid, something unrecognized expression, something like that. I can't remember what it was, but it certainly does not allude or point to the fact that your count all with an asterisk, which you've used everywhere and is common, like it's standard practice to write, is the issue. Yeah.
Well, and then again, the data restriction framework, I think it's parsing through your text of your query and saying, what fields are you accessing? Do you have access to that?
Yeah.
It's actually, I don't think it's
exactly.
I don't think it's entirely that. I did figure it out, and because like we're talking about the wrap, and I think it's because ultimately one of the wrappers around the Power Query that you've written is a select all, and because of how that's written, there's a definition there or something like that. It cannot be used within, and it's not so much because of the security of the columns, which I mean would make sense. It would be a logical assumption there, but it ends up being something about how the API actually wraps that query and ultimately calls it in.
Yeah.
So, Jim, have you had these types of frustrations in your development? I mean, are you going, yeah, a
little bit. We're still working on security. Our school, we're a smaller school, small private school, so we have a lot fewer admins. So we're not really. One of the things I want to do is I want to move more to a role-based security, so I can granularize who has access to what. That would be very, very helpful. But for the most part, there's only a few people that have access to everything, and then everyone else pretty much has access to everything in that school or everything in certain areas. We haven't utilized anything with field level security yet. and pass it to a role or anything like that. So the days will probably come there. And, security is a big thing. And I do understand that. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why in the student portal, you can't write to the database. You can't create a form and have them submit it. Maybe there were just too many student hackers in those days, and they said, we're going to close this loophole. This is how we're going to do it. But it brings it to another use of the API, right? You can have a student page that writes to a node file and then pushes it back into the database. There's one example that I wrote is all of our students have iPads, right? And they're all managed. They don't have an app store and they can't install apps. But what if they want an app that's not assigned? What if they want Netflix, right? Or Hulu or something like that. So I wrote a page in the parent portal, which has all these approved apps that we have. They click a button, and probably within about 10 seconds, that app is installing on that kid's iPad.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah. It's using 3 APIs. One that I wrote, this PowerSchool one, and then the mobile device manager has their own API. So I'm kind of like doing a juggle between 3 APIs, and it talks to all of them, and it makes it happen. So
it's awesome.
It's one way to use the API to get something done. We think, I can't do that, but you really can do that if you think about, okay, how do I need to get this system? Well, I have to log in and do this. Well, what if you could just use the API to do that? Well, then that system has to talk to this system. That's when you come in, write it's called middleware. How many of you wrote middleware, right? You have an application that sits in between 2 other systems that translates back and forth.
Oh, so that's like Node.js,
like a Node.js app sitting in the server, or something that allows you to, a lot of applications have middleware for authentication. Did you buy this software or did you get it from a friend, right? So it'll check your licensing information across some third-party system or something like that and verify it. That's kind of a middleware concept, but it's basically an application talking to their application.
Middleware is to the API what we were to Excel and CSV files when you would take it from one application to put into another.
Yeah, you are the middleware until you can figure out how to make your own scripting using scripting language. You become the middleware creator. So the API is useful in both directions, and it's just a matter of learning the code, whether it's Python, which is probably one of the fastest growing code bases out there, whether it's Node.js. If you're familiar with JavaScript, Node.js, you can just start learning how to use it, and then get a server box somewhere that can run it.
And I am by no means a Python expert. I barely call myself a dabbler, but I will say if you've learned, and I think a lot of people who are expert like developers with object-oriented languages would shudder to hear me say, if you know JavaScript, it's a good, foray into object-oriented languages. But the truth is that I remember when I learned JavaScript the very first time over the first couple of years, it's a struggle. Then when I started looking into Python after being, pretty handy with JavaScript, Python made a lot more sense because there's a lot of similarities in things.
JavaScript can be very messy, but it's powerful, but it's kind of strange how it works. The way it has, all these different. We want to get in all the different textures.
Not very strict is the right word, I think.
Yeah.
It's very loosey-goosey, to use a technical term.
I think strict is like the actual would be the technical term. It's not a strictly typed language, right?
It's not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why they came out.
Dynamically typed language is the technical term for it.
It's still object oriented, but there's a lot of room for error.
It can be object oriented.
Yeah, and but it gives you that insight into that world is what it did. So that's, like I said, when I started looking at Python, although the terms and the classes and everything were different, you could still draw parallels.
Yeah.
Well, hey guys, we're about out of time, and just wanted to throw it out there, see if there's anything else that you're just dying to talk about. If not, this has been super informative for me. That somebody that hasn't dealt a lot with API. Jim, you're a wizard and you don't even know it. I feel bad for your inbox if anybody gets a hold of your email address after this episode. You threw out a few projects out there that I think a lot of people would be pretty interested in, but alas, Jim, thank you very much for joining us. It was great chatting with you, and hopefully everybody listening and watching got a little something out of this as well. Eric, Ryan, pleasure as always. And until next time, guys, cheers.
Thank you, everybody.
Hey,
Yeah.
cheers.
I think it'll be back to school when we talk to everybody next.
Yeah. Welcome
Hey,
back.
everybody. There's a good topic.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Enjoy more episodes and learn more at mba-link.com.